Today's Saturday Extra video will be another take from the archives, as it were. Early on, I did a short video touching on the topic of treaty dodging. More specifically, how in the interwar years, various navies did their best to get around the naval treaties, be it Washington or London. Any discussion of interwar ship designs can't avoid the topic of those treaties, simply because these agreements would shape naval design for better or worse for 20 years, be it from limiting tonnage for new-built ships, or outright banning new construction entirely, as was the case for the capital ship Holiday. There was also the less well-known, but still important limit on how many aircraft carriers could be built, not directly in numbers, but because of how much tonnage could be allocated to the task. This one in particular resulted in the compromise that was USS Wasp. As I noted at the time, the result of these limitations would be creative attempts to find loopholes or otherwise dodge the restrictions. Sometimes it was through legalese and interesting interpretations of the fine print. Others through negotiations to keep ships that would otherwise have been scrapped. See, for example, Mutsu. She was due for scrapping until the Japanese protested and got an exception. That said, the more famous cases were definitely the outright treaty-busting designs, such as the Hipper-class cruisers, or to a lesser extent, Italy's Zara. In any case, what's common is that basically every navy tried some way to get around the treaties, to varying degrees, which often as not just resulted in various loopholes being slammed shut, such as, for example, Surcouf resulting in submarines with cruiser guns being limited, just as one example. In this video, I'll be going over some of the more well-known cases of this happening, and if it is relevant, what sort of issues trying to dodge treaties cause for the ships in question. We'll kick things off with probably the most famous example, and by far the largest case of creative interpretations of naval treaties. That being, of course, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. Okay, I'll admit to exaggerating a bit here, though less than you might think, because there's really no ignoring how a lot of interwar Japanese designs creatively interpreted rules. I've touched on this in a few videos by this point. In the aftermath of the various treaties, the Japanese had something of a thing for building light, while stuffing the ships to the metaphorical gills with as much equipment as they could fit aboard. This was especially dangerous for various classes of destroyers or torpedo boats, as the Tomozuru and 4th Fleet incidents demonstrate. Destroyer tonnage had been limited by the terms of the First London Naval Treaty, both in overall size and how many ships could be built. The Japanese tried to get around this with ships like the Chidori class, less than 800 tons, but with half the weaponry of the much larger Fubuki. The result is, perhaps, to be expected. The torpedo boat Tomozuru would capsize in rough weather on March 12, 1934, and have to be towed back to port. This would result in the entire class being completely rebuilt to more fit their light tonnage. Meanwhile, in 1935, you had the 4th Fleet incident, where the fleet in question sailed into a typhoon while on training on September 26, 1935. 2 new destroyers lost their bow, while the cruisers Mogami and Miyoko suffered cracks in their hulls. The carrier Ryujo had damage to her upperworks, along with flooding. The Japanese blamed the damage to the cruisers on newly adopted electric welding. That might hold a grain of truth, but at the same time, well, let's look at Mogami. Those light cruisers were built to the absolute limit of the Washington Treaty displacement rules. However, in typical Japanese fashion, they wanted as much as they could get on the lightest hull possible, mostly in regard to weaponry. 5 triple turrets for a total of 15 155mm 6.1-inch guns, along with 8 127mm 5-inch secondary guns, and 12 torpedo tubes and 4 triple mountings, on top of relatively heavy armor. This would, in the end, result in ships that were incredibly top-heavy, in spite of attempts to avoid that happening, as well as being fragile in service. Welds would crack during gunnery trials, and the ships would roll terribly. This was an issue that wasn't improved when it was revealed the ships were intended from the start to swap to heavier 8-inch guns, when Japan inevitably ditched the treaty system. Contrary to sometimes popular belief, it is not easy or simple to swap turrets or gun caliber. A lot of compromises had to be made to do so. The end result would be structurally questionable ships that required fairly substantial corrective refit, and still ended up overweight by treaty terms. Or to quote the British, they must be building their ships out of cardboard or lying. The Japanese insisted that Mogami was 9,500 tons. The actual displacement was more like 11,000. And then you had Ryujo, the carrier that isn't an aircraft carrier by the initial treaty restrictions. As laid out at Washington, a ship under 10,000 tons was not an aircraft carrier, no matter what it looked like. The Japanese tried to take advantage of this loophole, resulting in the London Treaty closing it, presumably with a stink eye in Japan's general direction. There are other examples I could go into, of course, but for now let's move to Europe. In both Italy and Germany, you can find a similar story to Mogami. Cruisers that outright broke the treaty limits, even as they supposedly held to them. The Italians, it must be said, at least attempted to hold to the treaty. For Italy, you had the Zara class of cruisers. Those heavy cruisers were a result of Italian naval staff deciding they wanted a more balanced cruiser compared to their previous, fast but lacking in armor Trento. The resulting design was originally intended to have armor more akin to early battle cruisers, 200 millimeters or 7.9 inches. Unsurprisingly, this would have busted the 10,000 ton limit, so it was quickly thinned down to the more reasonable but still quite thick 150 millimeters or 5.9 inches. A planned torpedo loadout was also removed, while further savings came in cutting down the propulsion system to a 2-shaft arrangement. Nonetheless, the Italians accepted that these ships would still exceed the treaty limit. They simply tried their best to not make it blindingly obvious this was the case, resulting in ships that were still around 1,300 tons overweight, or if you prefer, around 11,300 tons for the standard displacement. Still, the ships that came out were remarkably well balanced and designed ships, with excellent protection. Their fate at Cape Matapan is not an indication of flaws in the design of those ships. The Hippers, on the other hand, were perhaps the most flagrant case of treaty busting that there ever was. even more than any of the Japanese ships. The Japanese at least tried to hold to the treaty limits, even if they overloaded their ships, or found loopholes. The Germans, yeah, not so much. Admiral Hipper was stated to be inside the 10,000-ton standard displacement limit. The actual tonnage came out more like 16,000 tons. In fairness to the Germans, they had a persistent issue with overweight ships in this period. Bismarck famously displaces far more than she should. Nonetheless, there's no getting around the fact that the Hippers are very chronically overweight ships, especially for the capabilities they brought to the table. The same 8 203mm 8-inch guns as Zara, with added torpedoes consisting of 12 tubes and 4 triple mounts, but at the same time, substantially thinner belt armor, 3.1 inches, 80 millimeters at its thickest. The Hippers mostly got by because by the time they entered service, the treaty system was a dead letter, or in the case of Blucher and Prince Eugen, after the Second World War had already started. Either way, this was a general theme with trying to cram as much as possible inside treaty limits. You would often end up with overweight ships. It only varied in regards to if the ships were also lightly built, as well as overweight and top-heavy. This is also where we approach the end of the video, though there is one more note I want to touch on real quick. The first case of creative interpretation in the treaty, which came pretty much immediately after it was signed. One of the main impacts of the Washington Treaty was canceling a lot of capital ships then under construction or in the design process. Among others, all the new battle cruisers across the world. Japan's Omagi, Britain's G3, and the Lexingtons in the United States. However, there was an allowance towards converting ships into aircraft carriers. This was added at the insistence of then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. This allowed capital ships under conversion to reach 33,000 tons, compared to 27,000 tons for a purpose-built aircraft carrier. This would allow the United States to take 2 of the Lexingtons and convert them into massive, for the time, aircraft carriers. Except even 33,000 tons wasn't quite enough. The conversion plan envisioned something more like 36,000 tons. Shaving off another 3,000 wasn't really feasible. Technically possible, certainly, but at an unacceptable cost. For example, cutting the power plant in half. The Navy wasn't exactly a fan of that idea for obvious reason. So these ships were instead saved by creative interpretation of a clause in the Washington Treaty. A clause that allowed for modernizing capital ships to defend against aircraft or submarine attack. This specifically allotted 3,000 tons of extra displacement. Coincidentally, exactly, or close enough, to what the Lexingtons needed. As such, the United States argued this clause should also apply to ships converted to carriers. Thus, you had Lexington officially displacing 33,000 tons, with a footnote acknowledging that this didn't count weight for providing means against air and submarine attack. A legal loophole if there ever was one, but also something no one called out. In the end, the arms limitation treaties forced this kind of creative design work on navies. No one was willing to entirely give up new construction or trying to one-up potential enemies. As such, we got things like Lexington, Mogami, or Zara. Sometimes successful, sometimes not, but all the best attempts by their nations to make do with what they had, even if it meant sometimes breaking or at least bending the rules. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.